Teachers forced. Black boy to play piano to humiliate him, but his talent silences them all. It started as a cruel attempt to mock a young black boy's abilities. But what his teachers didn't know was that he had a secret talent that would leave them speechless. During class, they demanded that he play the piano, expecting him to fail miserably in front of his peers. They thought they could embarrass him, mocking his every move as he sat at the keyboard, waiting for him to stumble. But as his fingers touched the keys, something magical happened. The notes flowed effortlessly, his skill and passion for the piano shining through with every chord. What began as an attempt to humiliate him quickly turned into an awe-inspiring performance that left everyone in the room stunned. The teachers, who had intended to make him the butt of their jokes, were now silent, humbled by the raw talent and confidence the boy displayed. The once mocking atmosphere was replaced by admiration, and the boy had not only earned their respect, but had proven that true talent could never be suppressed. If you enjoyed Malik's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing stories. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Malik had always been a quiet and reserved 14-year-old, with a profound love for music that ran deep in his soul. His mother, a music teacher, had introduced him to the piano at a young age, and from that moment, music became his sanctuary. It was a place where he could pour out his feelings and express himself in ways that words never could. The piano gave him peace and clarity, a means to channel his emotions and thoughts. But his new school, a place he had hoped would offer him a fresh start, brought a host of challenges that he wasn't prepared for. Malik had recently transferred to this school in a neighborhood unfamiliar to him. The school was diverse, but, being one of the only black students in his class, he often felt out of place. He kept to himself, focusing on his studies and trying to avoid drawing attention to his race or background. Malik didn't want to be treated differently. He just wanted to fit in and be seen for who he truly was. Just another teenager trying to navigate life and its ups and downs. However, despite his best efforts, it became clear that not everyone shared the same perspective. Some of the teachers, particularly those in charge of the music program, had already formed preconceived notions about him. He could feel their judgment the moment he walked into the classroom, the way their eyes would scan him before offering even a simple greeting. It wasn't just about his skin color. He sensed that, in their eyes, he didn't quite belong. One teacher, in particular, stood out, Mrs. Parker, the head of the piano class. From the very first moment she laid eyes on him, Malik could feel the coldness in her gaze. She had a way of looking at him, as though his very presence in her class was a disruption, as if he didn't belong among the other students who were more fitting for the class. Despite Malik's undeniable musical talent, Mrs. Parker's attitude was clear. She treated him differently, even though she had never taken the time to get to know him. Malik could feel the subtle judgment in the way she watched him play, the way her eyes narrowed whenever he played a piece with ease. She seemed to question his ability, as though she assumed that someone from his background couldn't possibly possess the level of musical talent that Malik had honed over the years. It wasn't just in the way she treated him either. It was, in her words, too. Whenever she spoke to him, there was a certain tone to her voice, one that conveyed a sense of doubt and disbelief that he could be as good as the other students. Malik felt it deeply. He wasn't oblivious to the fact that, at this school, he was an outsider in many ways, whether it was because of his race, his background, or simply because he didn't fit the mold of the perfect student that some teachers expected. He knew how to handle it, though. He kept his head down, stayed focused on his passion for music, and avoided confrontation. Still, it wasn't easy. The judgment he faced from Mrs. Parker, who ironically was supposed to be one of his mentors, left a mark on his confidence. It was hard to perform in an environment where he felt like no one truly believed in him. Despite this, Malik refused to let her treatment define him. He continued to play the piano, losing himself in the music, even when it felt like the world around him didn't fully understand or appreciate what he was capable of. He knew deep down that he had something special, and he wasn't going to let anyone's narrow views prevent him from pursuing his passion. The music spoke for him when words couldn't, and every time he sat down at the piano, his talent became his voice, drowning out the negativity and the doubts others had about him. But as much as he tried to ignore it, the feeling of being unwelcome lingered. It was hard to shake off the feeling that, to Mrs. Parker, he was just another black kid who didn't belong in her class. No matter how much he proved himself, it felt like she would never truly see him for who he was, a gifted, hard-working musician who had earned his place in that room. And as time went on, the weight of that judgment began to wear on Malik, making him question whether he truly had a place in this world that often seemed so quick to judge him based on things he couldn't control. One day, during music class, Mrs. Parker made an announcement that would forever change the course of Malik's school year. She called on all the students to showcase their musical abilities, a way for her to assess their skills and perhaps even learn something new about them. When it came time for Malik to perform, Mrs. Parker's behavior took a turn that made Malik uneasy. She had a strange smile on her face, one that seemed to suggest she was waiting for him to fail, almost as if she were anticipating that he wouldn't live up to her expectations. She handed him a sheet of music with an air of indifference and said, "Play this piece for us, Malik. Let's see what you can do." Malik paused for a moment, but only for a fraction of a second. The smile on Mrs. Parker's face, the skeptical look in her eyes, ignited something inside of him. It wasn't fear that he felt, but a deep sense of determination. He knew this was his moment, his opportunity to prove to Mrs. Parker and to everyone in the room that his talent was undeniable. He didn't just want to impress them. He wanted to show them that he belonged, regardless of his race or background. Malik sat down at the piano with a calm focus, his fingers hovering above the keys. As he adjusted to the piano, the room fell into a deep silence, the kind that only came when something important was about to happen. His classmates were watching, some of them uninterested, others curious, but Mrs. Parker's eyes were fixed on him with a sense of expectation, waiting for him to mess up. Malik could feel the pressure mounting, but he refused to let it control him. He had been through enough in life to understand that some things were just out of his control, but this moment belonged to him. As his fingers began to glide over the keys, the music flowed effortlessly from him, each note striking with precision, every chord filled with emotion. It was as if his entire being was poured into the melody, his heart and soul carried through every movement of his hands. The music spoke for him, louder than any words could, telling a story that no one had ever heard before. It wasn't just a performance. It was a declaration of who he was, what he could do, and what he had the potential to become. His playing was flawless, the music rich with depth and expression, and as the melody continued, it was clear to anyone paying attention that this was not just a kid playing a simple piece of music. This was someone who had dedicated years of his life to mastering his craft. This was a performance that was breathtaking in its beauty, and the class fell silent, utterly captivated by the sound that filled the room. Mrs. Parker's expression faltered for just a moment, the smug look replaced by something else. Surprise, perhaps even shock. She had expected him to fail, to stumble over the notes, to make a fool of himself in front of the class. What she didn't expect was for him to perform with such skill and passion, making the piece sound effortless, as if it had been written just for him. As Malik played, he could see the students in the room begin to shift. Those who had ignored him, those who had made assumptions based on his background or his quiet demeanor, were now paying attention. They were witnessing something that transcended race or status, pure talent, and it was impossible to ignore. By the time Malik finished the piece, the room was silent. There was no applause, no cheers, just a heavy, collective pause as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Malik sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the piano keys, his heart still racing. He had done it. He had shown them who he was. The teachers and students who had doubted him were left with no choice but to acknowledge the raw talent and the soul that he poured into his music. Malik had proven that no matter where he came from or who they thought he was, his abilities spoke for themselves. Mrs. Parker, for the first time, seemed speechless. Her expectations had been shattered, and the disappointment in her eyes was unmistakable. She had misjudged him, assumed he wouldn't be able to rise to the occasion, and yet Malik had done far more than just meet the expectations. He had exceeded them. He had shown everyone in that room that talent, heart, and perseverance mattered more than anything else. But despite Malik's flawless performance, Mrs. Parker's smirk didn't fade. Instead, her attitude grew more dismissive, as though she couldn't bring herself to fully accept what had just unfolded. She hadn't expected Malik to be so good, and in her frustration, she began to scoff at him, searching for something to critique. "Well, Malik," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "I didn't expect you to have this kind of skill, but let's see if you can handle something a bit more challenging." Her tone was mocking, as though she was setting him up to fail. The class, which had been captivated by Malik's playing, grew still. All eyes turned to Mrs. Parker as the tension in the room increased, and it became clear to everyone that she was intentionally trying to undermine Malik's confidence. She wasn't even willing to acknowledge the undeniable brilliance in his playing. Instead, she focused on trying to break him down. Malik could feel the sting of her words, her need to put him in his place, to make sure he knew that despite his talent, he wasn't going to be allowed to rise above her in her class. He felt a wave of frustration wash over him, but instead of letting the negativity seep in, he took a deep breath and sat up straighter. He wasn't going to let her get to him. He had already proven himself, but now it was time to show her that. He would not back down from any challenge, no matter how unnecessary or petty it seemed. Without hesitation, Malik nodded, accepting the new challenge. Mrs. Parker handed him an even harder piece of music, one that required even more skill, concentration, and technique than the previous piece. He glanced at it briefly, but he wasn't intimidated. He knew what he was capable of, and he had no doubt that he could tackle this new piece just as easily. As Malik's fingers touched the keys, he felt a surge of energy. His fingers moved. With fluidity, the notes pouring out of him with even more intensity, more passion than before. It wasn't just the music that filled the room now. It was his soul. Every note seemed to resonate with the determination, the struggle, and the desire to be seen for who he truly was. He wasn't just playing the piano, he was playing his truth, expressing everything he had ever felt and believed. As he continued to play, the room grew silent again. Malik's performance had become a masterpiece, so full of depth and emotion that no one in the room could ignore it. His skill was undeniable, and his ability to capture the heart of the music was nothing short of extraordinary. The audience, the students who had been quiet at first, the teacher who had doubted him, could only watch in awe as Malik poured his heart into every key, every chord, every melody. It was impossible to deny that he was a prodigy, a once-in-a-generation talent who could command the piano as easily as he could breathe. Yet, despite the brilliance of his performance, Mrs. Parker still didn't seem to acknowledge the magnitude of what had just happened. She had set him up to fail, but now she couldn't admit that he had surpassed all her expectations. She couldn't admit that he had shown her up. Instead, she maintained her composure, though her tone had changed, to something more resigned, tinged with disbelief. "Interesting," she said flatly, almost as though she were trying to convince herself that what she had just witnessed wasn't that impressive. "You've certainly got some talent, but don't think it's enough to make up for a lack of discipline." Her words were dismissive, as though the skill Malik had just demonstrated was still not enough to win her respect. Malik could feel the sting of her criticism, but this time, it didn't affect him the way it had before. He had already proven to himself and to the room that he was more than capable. Her words were hollow, unable to diminish the power of his performance. He stood up from the piano, his posture proud but humble. His performance had spoken for him, loudly and clearly. It was clear to everyone in the room, except Mrs. Parker, that Malik was a force to be reckoned with. The students who had once whispered behind his back were now giving him nods of approval, their expressions filled with awe. They had witnessed something special, something they would remember for a long time, and even though Mrs. Parker's words were still laced with doubt, Malik knew that the music had already done the talking. The respect he had earned was undeniable, and no one, not even a teacher with her own prejudices, could take that away from him. The moment that would change, everything came next. Malik, no longer willing to be underestimated, sat at the piano and made a decision. He wasn't going to play from a sheet of music anymore. He was going to play a piece of his own, a composition that came straight from his heart. This wasn't a song that he had memorized or practiced for a performance. This was his truth, his emotions, and his story put into sound. The weight of everything he had been through, the struggles, the dreams, the quiet battles, and the hopes for a brighter future poured into every note. His fingers moved with a sense of urgency and depth, as if the music had to be heard, as if his soul had to be expressed in this moment. The room, which had been filled with chatter and skepticism just moments before, fell into an intense silence. The other students, who had watched him before with indifference or even doubt, now sat at attention, mesmerized by the music that filled the space. There was something different about this performance. It wasn't just the flawless execution or the technical brilliance, it was the raw emotion, the sheer authenticity that radiated from every key. Malik wasn't just playing a piano piece. He was revealing himself in the most vulnerable and powerful way possible. Mrs. Parker, who had spent so much time doubting his abilities, was now frozen in place, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. For the first time, her face softened, and the rigid expression of disbelief slowly began to fade. She stood motionless, her hands clasped in front of her as she listened intently, the music filling her with a realization she hadn't expected. The piece that Malik was playing wasn't just a performance. It was a reflection of who he was, of his life, and of the challenges he had overcome to get to this point. It wasn't just his talent that took her by surprise. It was the vulnerability, the honesty, and the passion he had poured into it. Mrs. Parker had underestimated Malik. She had assumed that because he came from a background she couldn't understand, he would never be able to play with the same level of depth or feeling as the other students. She had been wrong. Malik's talent had never been in question. But the emotion behind his playing, the way he was able to communicate his inner world through the music, was something entirely different. The sound that emanated from the piano was not just notes. It was a wave of power, of force, vibrating the air and filling the room with an energy that was undeniable. It was as if the music had the ability to change everything in its wake. The students, who had once looked at Malik with doubt, now found themselves captivated, their faces softening as they realized the depth of the performance. Some students, who had once mocked him, now listened quietly, their eyes wide with respect. Mrs. Parker could no longer ignore the truth. She had been too quick to judge Malik based on superficial assumptions. She had been blinded by her own biases. As she stood there, watching Malik's fingers dance across the keys, she finally understood what he had been trying to show all along. It wasn't just about playing the piano. It was about expressing who he was, sharing his story in a way that words could never do. Malik's performance wasn't for anyone else. It was for himself. And yet, in doing so, he had shown everyone in that room exactly who he was. Not just a talented musician, but a person with depth, with emotions, and with a story that was worth hearing. Mrs. Parker was stunned. Her thoughts raced, and she couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for the way she had treated him. In that moment, she realized that her assumptions about Malik had been completely wrong. She had failed to see his worth, to understand the power of what he had to offer. And now, as she watched him finish the piece, she couldn't help but feel ashamed. For the first time, she realized the true power of music, not just the technical skill, but the emotional depth it could carry. She had been so focused on judging Malik based on the surface, on his appearance and background, that she had missed the very thing that made him exceptional. Malik's music was not just about perfection, it was about the emotion that flowed through it. It was about telling a story that no one else could tell, a story that was uniquely his own. As the last notes of the piece filled the air, a deep silence fell over the room. For a few moments, no one moved or spoke. Everyone was still absorbing the power of what they had just witnessed. Malik sat at the piano, his fingers lingering on the keys, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of his breathing. He had given everything in that performance, everything he was. And in doing so, he had silenced every critic, every doubt, and every assumption about who he was. Mrs. Parker stood there speechless, her mind racing as she processed the experience. She could no longer deny Malik's talent, nor could she deny the depth of the music he had shared with them. It had changed the way she saw him, and in that moment, she realized that true talent wasn't just about technical mastery. It was about the heart behind the performance, the story behind the music. Malik had not only silenced her doubts, he had changed the way she viewed him, and perhaps the way she viewed herself. At the end of his performance, the room erupted in applause. The students, who had once treated him as an outsider, now recognized Malik for who he truly was, a brilliant musician. Mrs. Parker, standing at the front of the room, was left speechless. She had no words, just a look of genuine respect on her face as she nodded toward Malik. "Well done," she said softly, her tone now humble. From that day forward, things changed for Malik. He was no longer the quiet boy trying to fit in. He was a talented musician respected by his peers and teachers alike. Mrs. Parker, having seen the error of her ways, began to encourage Malik's growth, offering him opportunities to showcase his talents and learn even more. Malik's talent had not only silenced his critics, but had also opened doors for him that he never thought possible. For viewers, Malik's story is a powerful reminder that no matter where you come from or what people may think of you, your talent can speak louder than their ignorance. Stay true to yourself, embrace your abilities, and let your work speak for you. Talent, when nurtured and allowed to shine, can silence even the harshest of critics. Top of form.